Comes along and interjects. And this man stands with a camera filming me and tells me the next week he's put it on YouTube. Yes.
Europe.
Europe.
Are we going to be out of Europe because of what Cameron's trying to do and getting rid of Juncker?
Let's hope so.
I doubt it. But I can't really go into it. I haven't really followed that. I'm not the master on that subject, I must admit. Sorry. Next question.
Look what
You guys can join in. This is where you guys join in and throw things into the
What
air.
do you like? What's your specialty? Like, what are you? What are you trying
Marxism,
to?
communism, world politics, apart from Europe.
So you're for
history,
communism then? For or
History, a
against?
bit of philosophy, a little bit of science. Mixed leaks.
So nothing religious.
Oh no, I'm anti-religious.
Good.
Thank
I'm
God.
an atheist. I'm an atheist.
That's
What do you mean,
dumb,
thank God?
It's just an expression.
That's how deep it goes, you see. You can't avoid it. It just sunk right into the back of your brain and spontaneously emerges like that. Even your attack on God involves God, you know.
That's fair enough.
It's kind of bad, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just a habit, though.
How
Isn't
can
it?
a group like
Say it.
ISIS take over a country so easily, or attempt to take over a country so easily?
I think essentially it's the internal disintegration of the regime they tried to establish. This is Iraq. The internal disintegration of the regime that they've attempted to establish, the Americans and the British, and their allies on the ground, has been a signal failure. And as a consequence of that, living standards have fallen, conditions are people blame the government for alliances with the Americans and the British. The government has taken a sectarian position inside the country towards the Sunnis. So combine all those factors together and you have sufficient grounds for a minuscule army composed apparently 10% or more of British volunteers to seize control or effectively grab control of one city after another on the basis of a jihadist policy. Must also remember though that this jihadist army has the backing of quite important sections in Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia gives a lot of money towards jihadist and Wahhabist philosophy, basically. So this type of philosophy has been promoted. They spend more money than the Soviet Union used to spend on promoting communism, the Saudi Arabians. And so for a couple of decades, you've had in the region of like $100 billion spent to promote this philosophy. One spin-off was Bin Laden, another spin-off is the movement in, they call ISIS or ISIL in Iraq today.
Doesn't Saudi Arabia give money to the Wahhabis though? But that's Assad. Assad's, he's of the Wahhabi sect. Saudi Arabia supporting the Assad fighters though, not ISIS, because ISIS are part of the...
Well,
I know it's complicated.
the fundamental philosophy, that they're split-offs from various groupings, but the fundamental philosophy is Wahhabist, Sunni Wahhabism.
Yeah,
Now, there are spin-offs from that, and there are sections of the Saudi elite who back the movement. So,
ISIS.
it's not a direct, this is Saudi Arabia installing this movement.
No.
These are movements that are spin-offs from the promotion of Wahhabism across the whole of the region, beginning with Bin Laden, then to Al-Qaeda, then to, in fact, not beginning with Bin Laden, beginning with the Mujahideen.
Yeah,
with the Mujahideen.
Even before that, I mean, Afghanistan kicked out the British rule.
Yeah.
And that was a fairly Islamic army. So, I mean, it goes back years and years.
It goes back a long way, but effectively it's the Saudi Arabians and their feudal theocratic ideology
Money.
being imposed with money, with the vast resources they accumulate, in various movements across the whole of the region. So, but it's the collapse of the regime itself, the failure of the Americans, that's responsible for it. And this fool Tony Blair over the corner here, who comes out with the idea that this is really because we didn't bomb enough. I think this is just ridiculous. I mean, after all, the Americans and the British, they had 11 years from 2003 until now to train the Iraqi army and the Iraqi security services, and they did. They spent billions and billions on developing this army and security service. And yet, in the face of 5,000 fighters, 500 of whom apparently come from England or Britain, the entire 700,000 army collapses. Well, what sort of training are we giving these people if the army collapses at a single blow? So this is the utter incompetence of the Americans and the British that's responsible for this. You can't blame, even the Iraqi government can't really be blamed for it. It's the internal weaknesses of America and Britain that are reflected externally that causes this crisis.
So you don't blame the Iraqis themselves at all? No responsibility whatsoever?
Well, I didn't say that. I said the primary responsibility is with America and Britain. They dominated Iraqi politics, firstly by bombing the country, secondly by sanctioning the country, then by bombing the country again, then by invading the country, then by occupying the country, then by installing a regime in their image, then by carrying out so-called anti-terrorism measures that often involved attacks on innocent people. Around 1.4 million people have died in Iraq as a consequence of the war launched by Britain and America. So that has to be the primary consideration in understanding the dynamics of what happened in that country.
Would Saddam's regime been preferable then?
My friend,
I don't know.
The people prefer him. The people hate the Americans. The Americans have no place being there.
That may be the case.
People have no...
Serious question.
The essence of the question is falsely posed. It is not for Britain or America to determine the governments of other countries. Britain and America should determine their own affairs.
But there is moral obligation to allow people to have self-determination.
But the problem is, when people in Britain talk about moral obligation in relation to international politics, it generally reflects a misunderstanding about the genesis of British and American policy. The genesis of American British policy is a long-term historical process. And that long-term historical process, it's always been argued that there's some moral imperative on the part of Britain or the part of America.
Of any country.
We have invaded, well yes, but to be fair, Iraq has never invaded Britain, Afghanistan has never invaded Britain, Britain has invaded Afghanistan 4 times, Iraq twice in the past 20 years. So if you get a concept, or 25 years, if you have a concept about how the historical process developed, then if you look at the terminology, if you go back to the records, the Times newspaper, the Manchester Guardian from the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, you'll see every time Britain bombed another country, occupied another country, killed people in other countries, and don't forget, only 60 years ago, Britain had the biggest empire in the history of the world. In the history of the world. The sun never set on the British Empire. And therefore, when you look at the actual history of it and you refer to the documents, you'll see it always says, we have a moral obligation to intervene in Afghanistan. We have a moral obligation to intervene in India. We have a moral obligation to intervene in Korea. We have a moral obligation to intervene in China. It ends up the whole world is our moral responsibility. Well, what about our own morality involved in this? The Mau Mau in Kenya in the 1960s, tens of thousands were incarcerated in concentration camps run by the British. Last year they gave them compensation. How much did they pay them? £300. £300 per person. In Malaya, 1957, just before the British gave independence to Malaya, or basically Malaya gained independence, 1 million people out of 12 million people were in concentration camps. 1957. We had a moral obligation, of course, to help the Malays to defeat the communists, or so they said. The Americans said they had a moral obligation to bomb Laos, Cambodia, Korea and Vietnam, and they bombed them for nearly 40 years, bombed them into the Stone Age. They claimed it was a moral obligation because we support democracy and a totalitarian dictatorship is going to come to power otherwise.
So have there been any moral wars?
I can't think of any wars that have been fought by Britain for moral reasons.
So Sierra
that
Leone
doesn't mean
Kosovo,
not
or
been fought
Second
by
World War?
Britain for moral reasons.
Okay.
Moral reasons are given as a justification for intervention in a war.
What about Sierra Leone in 1997?
Often in retrospect. So, for example, the British generally believe that they fought in the Second World War, and many of the fighters would believe this, they fought in the Second World War to free the world of Nazism. Now, many of the people who fought believe this, but is that actually the reason why Britain fought in the Second World War? I argue no. Britain fought in the Second World War because Britain had an empire controlling most of the world. The shipping lanes were controlled by Britain, trade was controlled by Britain, and 1/5 of the surface of the planet was controlled by Britain. In those countries,